The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Howdy everyone, welcome to the PASS HADR virtual chapter. Good afternoon or good evening or good morning, depending on where you're watching us from. Just wanted to go through our monthly deck from PASS here with some brief community updates. If you are not already aware, the speakers for pre-conference sessions for PASS Summit have been announced. They have a wonderful slate of people signed up. You can learn more at the link at the bottom if you have not already seen which speakers and what sessions they are presenting. In addition to that, PASS Summit news, PASS is doing something new this year. They have a PASS Summit blogger program. So if you are a blogger and interested in becoming an official PASS Summit blogger, they're going to be offering opportunities such as press activities, ability to interview VIPs and presenters and vendors. Plus, apparently there's a discount involved. So if that's something you might be interested in, they are taking applications for official PASS Summit bloggers through April 25th. So you have a couple weeks to think about that. If you'd like to learn more, that link is at the bottom of the screen as well. Additionally, if you're considering registering for PASS Summit as an attendee, we have a discount code here on this slide. It is SSDISBPI1. If you register for PASS Summit with that discount code, you can get a $150 discount off your registration. Also, the group gets some of that as well, or gets not some of that, but a financial kickback as well. So if you'd like to help support the group, please register with that discount code. We'd be happy if you did. Additional PASS virtual chapters have plenty of activities coming up here. We have Global Italian, virtualization, data architecture, cloud, more cloud, DBA fundamentals, application development, DevOps. So there's a whole bunch of upcoming virtual group webinars, as there always are. And PASS has many virtual groups, all of which have the exact same logo with slightly different colors. I like the old ones better, but that's okay. We have some SQL Saturdays coming up as well in the next month or so. We have locations around North America, Europe, and Latin America. So maybe if you're local to one of those, you'll be attending. And finally, you are always welcome to connect with PASS through their various social media outlets. And that is the end of our PASS deck. So for this month's meeting, we are very privileged to have with us Elizabeth Noble, who's going to be speaking about distributed availability groups. So I'm going to go ahead and hand the screen share over to her and let her get started. So hang on just a moment here.
All right, I think we're good.
Awesome.
Hi, thanks for joining the HADR PASS virtual chapter and joining my session on using distributed availability groups for your migrations. So today we're going to discuss a scenario that I found myself in. I worked for a company that had been acquired, and part of that acquisition was the new company wanted us to move all of the information in our data center to a new data center. And so there were some discussions, honestly, before I started about how we could go about setting that up. And to give you a little bit of background, the environment that that company had was they had availability groups for production. So they had 2 synchronous and 3 asynchronous nodes for their availability group, and it was essentially, how do we migrate that information? How do we have a short downtime and pull this off without really having too much pain on our production environment? So when working with availability groups, we really wanted to keep those availability groups up and running. So one of the things that you can do starting, I'm not sure if this one was SQL Server 2016, but there is the possibility to have one availability group cross multiple domains and multiple data centers. One of the reasons that this was ruled out for my particular scenario was we were actually going to be migrating from a Texas, Colorado data center to Michigan. So there were some concerns about network latency and such. So what I'm here to talk about is some other options on how to keep your availability group up and running and how to move to a different data center. And so this is kind of the scenario that we're starting with, you have a data center, you've got an availability group in that data center with an Active Directory domain. Our original migration path was we were expecting to move to a new data center with a new Active Directory domain. And so that's one of the reasons why we started looking at some additional scenarios, particularly available with SQL Server 2016, and how we came to the conclusion to look into distributed availability groups and see what kind of functionality and what kind of options those provided for us. So just so you're aware, my name is Elizabeth Noble. I'm on Twitter as SQL Zelda, and I'm an IDERA ace for this year. And so I would just like to spend some time today talking to you about how to set up distributed availability groups for your environment. And just to kind of give you an idea of where we're headed, this will be mostly focused on setting up distributed availability groups. So this is more about having an availability group or setting up a new availability group in one data center and then moving that to another data center using distributed availability groups. Anything kind of outside of setting up those availability groups is outside of the scope of what I'm planning on talking about today. So in this scenario, as I said, we were planning on crossing multiple domains. So in order to cross those multiple domains, we needed to find something that would allow us to send data across those domains fairly easily. We also wanted to make sure that we could keep the data flowing, keep production up and running on our first data center while kind of standing up and getting ready for that migration in the second data center. So we didn't really want something that would have additional issues if we had to go, say, from Texas to Michigan. And then the company I was working for was pretty much 24/7 uptime. And we wanted to make sure that we had the shortest outage window possible or maintenance window possible. So we wanted something that would allow us to easily transition from one data center to another without really having a whole lot of downtime. So when we started looking into options, that's kind of where distributed availability groups stood out. And so kind of one of the first things to consider is if you're thinking about distributed availability groups, you need to be on SQL Server 2016. So we kind of started with the assumption of we're going to get on SQL Server 2016, and that's going to be part of our migration path moving forward. And there are some advantages to using distributed availability groups. You have the option of you can have a distributed availability group on one domain, on two domains, on no domains. That kind of flexibility exists. You also can use Windows Server failover clusters for one of the availability groups, both, none, that's also an option. And then you can actually use distributed availability groups across various operating systems. So this can be two different versions of Windows Server. This can be Windows to Linux. That type of functionality is supported. I will say your availability groups have to be running the same version of SQL Server. So that is something to keep in mind. You can't have SQL Server 2016 and SQL Server 2017. That's not a supported use at this time for distributed availability groups. So to give a little bit of terminology before we get started, in this demo, we're going to create our first availability group, and then we're going to create a second availability group. And so if you think about it, when you try to talk to your coworkers, your peers about what's going on with your availability groups, it can get a little confusing because you're going to have two availability groups. If we used the current terminology, they would both have a primary and a secondary. And then, you're either talking about the primary for the first availability group or the primary for the second availability group. So Microsoft has helped us out and tried to help us come up with some terminology so that we can all speak the same language internally. So whichever availability group is the one that can accept the writes, is what I'm referring to as your first availability group. And the node that can accept writes is going to be, in terms of a distributed availability group, called your global primary. The secondary node on that first availability group is still called a secondary, so that's pretty standard. And then your second availability group is going to be called, it's still your second availability group, but the read-only node, which would be a primary, but it's going to be accepting information from that first availability group, is called your forwarder, and that's and then that forwarder is then forwarding information on to its secondary. So I'll be using these terms when I'm referencing the slides and the demos to kind of get us a little more familiar with them. Oh, and I just want to let you know, if you guys have any questions, feel free to enter those through your webinar. Just type them in. If I see one and it looks like it's time sensitive, I'll try to kind of throw it in with my presentation. Otherwise, I'll go ahead and answer the questions at the end. So don't forget to use that if you've got questions. So kind of as we're walking through this scenario, the left-hand side is going to be our original data center with our original availability group. That's what production is running off of right now. We don't want to affect that. We want that to keep working moving forward. As part of our process to move to this second data center, we're going to stand up. In my case, in this demo, I created another Windows Server failover cluster and another availability group. What's a little different about this is that when you create that second availability group, you don't want to include any databases in that availability group. So you can have the databases sitting there, but for now, we're just going to create essentially kind of an empty availability group. And there we go. So in order to create that availability group, this would be the T-SQL code that you would use. Create availability group with your availability group name. The next line is where everything's happening at, and it's where you specify with distributed. So that's where you're telling SQL Server that you're wanting to create a distributed availability group. The next section for AG1, that's your first availability group. You're going to provide a listener URL there. That is recommended per Microsoft's documentation, is to use a URL when creating your distributed availability group. In this case, I'm using asynchronous commit. It is possible to have an availability group with synchronous commit, but for the purpose of my demo, I was simulating having to travel a long distance, so I didn't want to get, I knew when we went live with it, I wouldn't have a synchronous commit happening, I would have it asynchronous, so I kind of wanted to walk through what that was like. The failover mode is manual. This is the only failover mode that is currently supported for distributed availability groups, and when we walk through the data center migration, we'll kind of walk through how that works. One of the features with distributed availability groups is you have the option for a manual or automatic seeding mode. Direct seeding is kind of what the automatic side is called, and that's essentially where, when you create the availability with the distributed availability group, the databases will start getting created on that second availability group for you. In my case, I went with a manual seeding, which meant that I needed to restore the databases manually, and that's kind of the demo we're going to walk through, is manual seeding. I've talked to some of my peers, and it's kind of come back that essentially, if you've got large databases or really high transactions, you may want to see if you can create a test environment to simulate an automatic seeding, if that's something you're thinking about, because I have heard that it can be a little nerve-wracking, I'll put it that way. Similarly, when you create your second availability group, you're going to give the same sort of information. The listener URL is going to be different. So that's the listener URL for the second availability group. The other three values are going to be the same. So in this case, it's going to be asynchronous commit, manual failover, and manual seeding. In order to fully create your distributed availability group so that your first availability group and your second availability group know what's going on, you have to go to your second availability group and use alter availability group on the second availability group to tell it, hey, you're part of a distributed availability group. At that point in time, your first the information you provide for the first availability group and the second availability group, those are going to be the same. And this is essentially what it's going to look like. So it's going to have your Windows Server failover cluster on your first availability group. And then, as you can see, there's a bar at the bottom specifying that the distributed availability group is essentially connecting those two pieces together. Now, if you can see, they're connected. So the first availability group and the second availability group are connected together. However, there isn't any data flowing at this time. So essentially, both availability groups know they're part of a distributed availability group, but they're not capable of sending any information back and forward to each other, not backwards and forwards, but just forwards. So in the case of manual seeding, and you'll see in the demo, I have the databases restored. They're sitting in no recovery. Once I get that second availability group created, then I'm going to go ahead and add those databases to the second availability group. And first I go ahead and add it to the forwarder on the second availability group. And at that point in time, it'll look like everything's up and running on a distributed availability group. But of course, everything will not be up and running in terms of all of the nodes until I add the database on the secondary of the second AG to the availability group on the second AG. And then once I go ahead and add those databases on the second AG, that's when data will be able to move asynchronously from the global primary to the forwarder. So data will get inserted into the global primary will send data to its secondary, and the global primary will also asynchronously send data over to the forwarder. The forwarder will then send data to its secondary. So to kind of walk through what that looks like for building the distributed availability group, you're going to start, generally, if you're doing this in your environment, you're going to start with your data center, your availability group. You're then going to create an availability group in the second data center. You're going to tell the first availability group it's part of a distributed availability group, tell the second availability group it's part of a distributed availability group. That's going to kind of link them together. And then once for manual seeding, once both of those databases have been added to the second availability group, that asynchronous connection is going to be flowing through all four of those nodes. So let's look at a demo of what that's going to look like. Okay, just going to slow this down just a little bit. It keeps me from clicking all over the place. And then we'll zoom in and see if we can get that all squared away. Looks like it's not going to zoom in for you guys. Let me see if I can figure out a different way to zoom in. Okay. My Zoom It loves me, but it doesn't seem to love you guys. Nope. All right, well, we'll walk through this as is. Hopefully you're not on too small of a screen. So in the query window, what I'm doing is I'm really just getting prepped to set up my availability groups. In this scenario, we're actually We're actually going to create the first availability group and the second availability group. So in this kind of scenario, we're starting from scratch. And part of the reason that I wanted to do that is I wanted to show, hey, there are no tricks here. This is from beginning to end. There aren't any special configuration settings set up. That said, I am using a multi-subnet environment, so my endpoints do have certificates on them, and that's probably like the only secret sauce that's really going on in terms of this presentation. So I've got some logic set up here to restore the database to the secondary on the first AG, even though the first AG isn't built. And then what's going to be my second AG, I've got some scripts here to restore the database to what will become the forwarder and the secondary on the second AG. In this case, if you notice, I've got two different file paths, and that's actually one of the reasons that I needed to do manual seeding, is because it didn't really know where to put the databases on my second AG. So go ahead and run that, and I'm trying to see if I can zoom in real quick, and my computer is telling on me, so it shouldn't do that. So over on the left-hand side on Object Explorer, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just confirming that yes, the database is on what's going to become our global primary. If you see where I'm at, I just showed that the database was not on, or it was in recovery. It's on recovery on basically all of the other nodes. So we're just going ahead and verifying that yes, the databases are there. No, they're not part of an availability group. No, they're not synchronizing. And then once again, just showing I haven't created any availability groups. There's really nothing special happening with these servers. They're just kind of sitting there with databases in recovery. This is a script to go ahead and create the availability group. This has been modified from Mike Val's scripts that he put on a blog post, which is referenced later in this slide deck, on how to create an availability group using PowerShell. So it's gone ahead and it's creating a listener in the availability group for the first availability group. So once this finishes running, we'll go ahead and check that out. And I'll quit doing that. So we're going to go ahead and see that the first availability group's been created. And I'm just going ahead and refreshing those connections so that we can see the availability group. And as you can see, I've got two nodes, primary and a secondary. I've got a database and I have a listener. And then we'll go ahead and check the second node in the first availability group and make sure that it's also working just fine. I've got two nodes. As you can see, the database has a little caution symbol on it. I actually didn't add that database to the availability group, so we're just going to go ahead and do that through the GUI. And that'll just take a second, and then we'll confirm that the database is being synchronized on both nodes. So let's go ahead and refresh that connection. And there you go. You can see that the database is synchronized on that availability group. So at this point, we're at a regular availability group. We're now going to go ahead and create that second availability group. So now we're kind of starting in the slide deck where we had the Windows Server failover cluster on one side and another Windows Server failover cluster on the other side, and both had their own AGs. So we haven't actually, we're not ready to create a distributed availability group. We're just kind of getting the groundwork up and running to go ahead and get that created. So this should just take a couple seconds. It's not too terribly long. I did do some different configuration stuff here. So I don't know if you noticed, but the first availability group was using a different port than the default port. This one's using the default port. So, you can kind of do a little bit different configuration stuff between your two different availability groups if that's what your business is expecting. Just similarly, I have instances on my second availability group and not my first availability group. Or I guess I have two different instances or two different names. So as you can see, I've got an availability group set up on The second AG now, it's got 2 nodes, it doesn't have a database, and I'm going to go ahead and check the secondary and make sure the secondary looks good as well. Once again, no database. It also has a listener. That listener name is different between the first availability group and the second availability group. And as you can see, both of the databases are still in a restoring state. So they're not part of an availability group. The databases don't know that they're supposed to be doing anything in particular. At this point in time, I'm going to run a command to go ahead and create that distributed availability group. So in this case, I'm creating the availability group. I'm giving that command on the first availability group, and we'll go ahead and get that set up and running. You can do this across different domains. When I was setting up this lab, I had a little bit of a difficulty getting my distributed availability group up and running. So I actually ended up moving back to the same domain, but that's not necessary. As you can see, when I'm looking at the distributed availability group that I've set up on the first AG, you can see that I have essentially two nodes, 2 replicas. One is the first AG, that's the one that's online and synchronizing. The second one is the one that shows offline, so that's our second AG. Because if you remember correctly, I've created the distributed availability group on the first AG. I haven't told the second AG that it's part of a distributed availability group yet. So it makes sense that that second availability group would show offline. In addition, distributed availability groups don't have databases. They're essentially an availability group of availability groups. So that's kind of what their children are. And then listeners are not supported as part of your distributed availability groups. And then we'll go ahead and check out the second AG. At this point, I'm really just showing, hey, the second AG doesn't know it's part of a distributed availability group yet. So that's all we're verifying right here, is just showing we've gone ahead and created part of the distributed availability group, but it isn't entirely set up and running at this point in time. So the script that I'm going to run next is the alter availability group on the second AG. This is where I'm now kind of connecting those 2 AGs together and telling that second AG, hey, you're part of a distributed availability group. Come and join the party together, and so we can get you set up and sending data back and forth. So in this case, I've now refreshed my connection on the second AG, and as you can see on the second AG, I now can see that I have a distributed availability group. I can tell that there are 2 replicas, that there is a primary and a secondary. Once again, there are no databases, there are no listeners. That's to be expected. And as you can tell, even though the second AG knows it's part of a distributed AG, it's still showing that the data isn't flowing. So that's what we're going to set up next. So we're going to go ahead and check some stuff out. I'm going to confirm that the distributed AGs are configured and running the way that I expect them to, which is, as you can tell, the databases are not attached to availability groups, so they're not necessarily, they're not included, they're not getting information sent back and forth at this time. So my next steps are to go ahead and add the databases to the second availability group. So the first command I'm going to run is going to add the database to what is the forwarder of the distributed availability group. And it's going to take a couple seconds. And then when we go ahead and refresh this, we'll see that the database on the forwarder is synchronized. And if we look at the distributed availability group, we no longer have that red X. We are showing that the distributed availability group looks healthy. It looks like it's up and running. The one gotcha here to keep in mind is that you've got 3 of the 4 nodes online. If we go check this secondary on the second AG, that database has not been added to the availability group. The data is not synchronizing. So data is currently flowing to the global primary, the secondary, and the forwarder, but not the second secondary. And now that we've gone ahead and added the database to the second secondary, when we refresh this, we're going to see that the database is now synchronizing. So I want to point out, like, this is it. Like, your distributed AG at this point in time is up and running. So you can put data in your global primary. That data will be sent over to your second AG, which is the forwarder. So now when something goes into your global primary, it writes to the secondary on the first AG. It writes to the forwarder on the second AG. It writes to the secondary on the second AG. So data is now moving everywhere that we would be expecting it to move. So we've gotten everything set up and running to get ready for our migration. So at this point in my career, this is where you would be having the go, no go meeting. This is where you'd be telling people, I'm ready to do the database migration. I'm ready to move to the new data center. And you might want to let that sit for a while. There are some DMVs that you can use to monitor the health of your distributed availability groups. One thing to keep in mind is, remember, the only type of failover mode that's supported is manual. So you want to make sure that that network connection is solid between your two data centers while you've got this set up and running. There's also some additional functionality you can do in terms of checking for synchronization errors, looking at logs to make sure that your information is going over and that your data is synchronizing. So that's stuff you can do to kind of monitor your distributed availability group while you're waiting for the big cutover to the new data center. So to get ready for the cutover to the new data center, there are a couple things that you have to keep in mind. One of those is you're going to have a manual failover. So there is no automatic failover supported. And because it's a manual failover, we've kind of got to go through some extra steps to get things up and running the way we want. So manual failovers to me can be a little intimidating. So one of the goals in performing that manual failover is to make sure that you're not losing any data as part of this failover. So one of the recommendations from Microsoft is to make sure that you stop all data traffic to your global primary. You want to make sure that you aren't having any data that's getting updated, deleted, inserted. You want to keep everything constant while you're trying to do this cutover. And that's kind of the safest way to make sure that you don't lose any data. So let's see here. So then you're going to go ahead and set your distributed availability group to synchronous. So, cutover nights happened. We've gone ahead. We've made sure that none of the applications can write to our global primary. At that point in time, we're going to change our distributed availability group to synchronous. We want to make sure that everything's, intending to get everything's flowing as it happens. It's getting caught up. And one of the reasons that this is safer at this point in time is because there is no data being written to it, right? So that nothing's changing, but we're just kind of getting in the process of getting caught up on our data flow. So to kind of go back to the images of what this would look like. So previously that red bar used to say asynchronous. Now it says synchronous. That's really the biggest change that we have going on in this scenario. So when we get to the point where we're failing over, it's going to be a little nerve-wracking. We're going to have to all be brave. So one of the things that is recommended by Microsoft, again, is to check the final LSN on your first availability group. That's how you're going to make sure that all the data that you expect to move from your first AG to your second AG, this is how you're kind of double checking that all the data made it. So you're going to get the LSN from your first availability group, and then you're going to go to your second availability group, and you're going to keep checking to see what the most recent LSN is. And when you get to the point that the LSNs match, that's when you know that all your data has made it over. Now, I've heard that there can be issues if you have like large batches of transactions, big transactions that are coming through, that the LSNs may match, but that like the redo queue still hasn't gotten everything caught up. So there are some additional queries that you may want to look into to kind of make sure that not only has the information made it over there, but it's been all caught up in terms of what's also been redone on that second availability group. So at this point, all the data's caught up. We're not having anything written to the applications, and we're now really getting into where we're really going to start doing that cutover. So at this point in time, you're going to take the first availability group and you're going to change it to a secondary. So what that means is you're going to have two availability groups that are secondaries under this distributed availability group. So it's kind of like there isn't any availability group that's in charge right now. And that's part of the process, part of the intention of getting this migration set up. Let me go, I think I just clicked a little too fast. Nope, we're good. Okay, so at that point in time, I've put a red X on the data flow because if they're both secondaries, there really can't be any data flowing between those two availability groups because if data's coming in, it's not really going anywhere. This is where we're ready to do that manual failover. So for the manual failover, this is why we did all that double checking. This is why we turned off all the applications to the global primary. This is why we made things synchronous and checked our LSNs, because as far as I'm aware, I think it still stands, the only supported way to move from your first AG to your second AG and make your second AG your global primary is to do this force failover allow data loss. And I'm sure most of us don't really love typing the words allow data loss in any of our processes, but if you're going to go with this method of distributed availability groups, that's what you're going to need to do, is you're going to need to force failover allow data loss. So that's why we got all that prep work behind us to make sure that we're comfortable and ready to go ahead and fail over to that what is currently our second availability group. So in this case, we've done force failover, allow data loss, and now, as you can tell, on our second availability group, that's where our global primary is. So on the second availability group, we've got a global primary, it's writing to its secondary. The global primary on the second availability group is also writing to the forwarder on the first availability group, and then that forwarder is sending information to its secondary. So in this case, it's all synchronous. That's because we are, before the failover, set everything to synchronous. It's, for my way of thinking, if I were to do a big migration from one data center to another, I'd want to leave this distributed availability group up for a while, but I wouldn't want to be negatively affected by having the synchronous connection in terms of lag between for instance, like Michigan and Texas. So I'd want to go ahead and change that back to asynchronous. So this is the SQL Server command you would give to go ahead and change that distributed availability group back to asynchronous. And for me, that would give me the peace of mind to leave this distributed availability group kind of up and running for a little while. So we've now gone ahead and changed to where the flow is now asynchronous instead of synchronous. There are some things to keep in mind, and they're kind of outside the scope of this conversation, but you kind of want to think about your listeners. If you remember correctly, we've got a listener on the first AG, we've got a listener on the second AG. They've got two different names, so you got to figure out with your team how your applications are going to handle that. So to walk through the cutover to the data center, you've got your first AG and you've got your second AG. When you get your distributed availability group up and running, at the beginning, it's going to be an asynchronous flow. When you get ready to do your cutover to that second AG, you're going to change that asynchronous flow. You're going to make that asynchronous flow synchronous. And that's what we've changed right here. We've just gone from asynchronous to synchronous. This is where you're starting to get you've already cut off your applications writing to the global primary. You're now trying to figure out what the most recent LSN is on your first AG, and you're comparing that on the second AG to make sure that the second AG has the same most recent LSN also applied to it. And at that point, that's when you set both, you update the first AG and say, hey, you're going to be a secondary now. And so that's where you have two secondaries, and that data flow is no longer happening. So the connection is broken, there's no data, there's still a distributed availability group, but there's no data really that can be put into those availability groups. When you go ahead and indicate that you're going to force failover and allow data loss, that's when the second availability group then becomes your global primary. And since we previously specified that the distributed availability group is going to be synchronous at this time, that connection is synchronous. So as part of the data migration, if you're waiting for smoke testing and such, I would go ahead and change your connection to asynchronous. And that way you're not having to deal with network latency between your global primary and your forwarder. And then as you move forward, you're going to be ready to go ahead and decommission that original data center. So you're going to drop your distributed availability group. And that's going to give you kind of where you started at. You're going to have your first availability group and your second availability group, except at this point in time, your second availability group is where all your applications are writing to. When you're ready, you go ahead and get rid of that first data center, and then it's almost like you didn't do any of this. It's all kind of magic behind the scenes, and your applications have their availability groups up and running, and hopefully for the most part, nobody's the wiser that you've gone through this process of migrating to the new data center. So we're going to walk through another demo. Okay, so in this part, what I wanted to do first of all is I had shown you that the distributed availability groups were up and running and that they were synchronizing, but I do want to show, hey, I put some data in my first availability group and it ended up in my second availability group after my data center migration. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just selecting from a table that exists and showing there's no data in there. And then I'm going to go ahead and insert a record and then select from the table and show that there is data in there. So we're going to look at the results. As you can see, there's no records, then there's one record. So just remember, we've inserted one record into a table. We're going to go ahead and now we're simulating the fact that we've stopped the data flow. Nothing's going to happen. And now we're going to go ahead and take our distributed availability group and set it up as synchronous. And that was fairly straightforward to set that up as synchronous. At this point in time, I'm going to go ahead and check for the LSNs. So I'm going to make sure that the most recent LSN, I'm going to go find that number in my first AG, and I'm going to keep track of that number. As you can tell, it is some really, really long number. I would recommend that if you're planning on doing this cutover in the middle of the night where you might, get a little bleary-eyed, you might want to come up with a little bit more elegant of a way to kind of track this number and systematically compare it. So we're going to remember this LSN, we're going to kind of keep track of it, and we're going to start comparing it to the other system. In this demo, I got a little excited, went ahead and changed the role to secondary. So normally you would want to actually check for your LSNs on the second AG first. So we'll go ahead and run that real quick and check for those check the LSN on the second AG. And in this case, you can see that the LSNs are the same number. So we've confirmed that our information has flowed over as we expected. So at this point in time, we basically have a distributed availability group. The first availability group and the second availability group are connected, but remember, they're not sending information back and forth since we set the first AG to a secondary. So now we're going to go ahead and force failover, allow data loss, and that should get our distributed availability group back up and running. So once we run that, we should have a distributed availability group up and running, and we'll be able to confirm that in Object Explorer. However, what's going to change a little bit is when we first looked at the top server connection, it was showing that both replicas were synchronizing. Now it's a little different. Now our third server connection, which is actually It used to be our forwarder. It's now our global primary. As you can see in the distributed availability group, now it's showing both of the replicas are synchronizing. That's kind of our hint that this is now our new global primary. And we'll go ahead and check what used to be our global primary. And when we expand those replicas, you'll see that one of them has the 2 arrows and one of them has a question mark, and that's signifying that this one is now our forwarder. So we'll just go ahead and check the table. So we are actually connecting to, when we started this part of the demo, this was the forwarder. So we're connecting to what used to be the forwarder, but we've done that failover with data loss, and it is now our global primary. And I'm going to show you that data did make it over. So we did go, you know, from one availability group to another, we did send that data from one side to another. And that's essentially what you can see here. So to continue our simulation, we've kind of confirmed that yes, the data is, you know, in our new data center, it's up and running, we're good to go. We are now going to get our distributed availability group set up to kind of maybe sit around for an hour a day, kind of whatever your company decides is the preferred method. And so to kind of make sure that we don't have any performance issues from leaving the distributed availability group up after our data center cutover, we can set the distributed availability group back to asynchronous. And that's going to help keep the data flowing, but not cause our global primary to wait for any latency on the network. So now that we've done our cutover, we've done our, you know, smoke testing, we've confirmed everything's up and running, we're ready to drop the availability group. You only need to run one of these commands on one of the replicas. In this case, just to keep in mind, if you try to use the GUI to get rid of a distributed availability group at this point in time, it will not drop that availability group. So the only supported way at this point in time to drop that availability group is to use T-SQL and use the drop availability group command. So that's what we're going to run right here. And then once we do that, we should be able to see that the distributed availability groups have been dropped. I ran both of them, so that's why it gave you an error. So just so you know, you only need to drop it in one place. And then hopefully we'll go check and make sure that those distributed availability groups are gone. So we're just going to trust ourselves. All right, so we'll go ahead and recap. Just as I said, remember that if you're going to get rid of your distributed availability group after your migration, don't forget to use the drop availability group T-SQL command to get rid of that distributed availability group. And then to kind of walk through the entire process from beginning to end. So, you know, we get the project, we get assigned, hey, you know, we're going to need to migrate from one data center to another. So you're going to start with, you know, your first data center, you've got your first AG, and that's your starting point, right? So the next thing you're going to do is you're going to create that second availability group. And remember, when you create that second availability group, it's going to be an availability group. It's going to have a listener. It is not going to have any databases in that availability group. And that's regardless of whether you do automatic or manual seeding. In either case, you don't want any databases there. If you do forget and you put a database there, SQL Server will come back to you when you try to create your distributed availability group and let you know that your second availability group cannot have any databases inside the availability group. So you can have your databases staged on the server, they just can't be in the availability group. Once you have your first and second availability group set up, you're going to go ahead and you're going to create that distributed availability group on the primary of your first AG, and then you're going to go to the primary of your second AG, and you're going to alter that distributed availability group. And at that point in time, that's where you really have your global primary on the first AG and your forwarder on the second AG. But at this point in time, there's still no information flowing backwards and forwards, or back and forwards. So The next steps are going to be for direct seeding is going to be to restore, like you already have the database there with no recovery, you're going to add the database to that second availability group. So if you're doing manual seeding, you're going to have to add the database to the availability group, not only on the forwarder, but on the secondary of the second AG. Once you get both of those added to the availability group, that's when the data will be flowing through all of the nodes. You'll have data being read or written to your primary, your global primary, which will then, if it's a read or a write or an update, it'll be then flowing to your secondary on the first AG. The global primary will also asynchronously send data over to your forwarder, and then that forwarder on the second AG will send the data to its secondary. Once you're ready to start talking about your data center migration, you're going to want to stop all of the data from being written to your global primary. However, your connections are still up and running, and that's why it's important to make sure when you stop that data flow that you are confirming that the data isn't being written. Because at this point in time, you're entering into where you want to start having control of all of that data and tracking it all. So you go ahead and set the data flow to synchronous. This is where you're going to get the most recent LSN on your global primary, and you're going to start making sure you're going to start running that other query to get it to match on the forwarder. And you're not until they match are you going to do anything else. So while you're waiting for those two numbers to get caught up, you're just going to keep rerunning that query on the forwarder to make sure your LSNs match. When your LSNs match, that's when you're ready to set the first AG to a secondary, and that's where you're going to have essentially two secondaries, and so there's really nobody in charge to take information in, and that's where you can't really write to either one. Once you fail over and allow data loss, you're going to actually have the data flowing the other direction. So your global primary will then be your second AG. It'll be flowing synchronously to the forwarder on your first AG. When you're considering smoke testing, you may want to change that connection to asynchronous, leave that up and running till you kind of get the sign off that you're ready to start decommissioning that first data center. So when you're ready to decommission the first data center, all you need to do is just drop that distributed availability group or drop availability group with the distributed availability group name, and then you can go ahead and get rid of the first data center. So that's essentially how you're going to walk through moving your database or databases from one AG to a second AG by using a distributed AG. I just want to give special thanks to Jonathan Cahias, who has a great blog post on setting up a multi-subnet SQL Server test environment. That's kind of where I got my start at for setting this environment up. Mike Fowl, who has some PowerShell on building availability groups. I also found a lot of documentation on Microsoft's page helpful in terms of distributed availability groups, how to configure those. There's some information on domain independent availability groups and interoperability. So that's kind of where you can go from Windows to Linux. So thank you for attending, and I'm going to go look at these questions and see what I can do to help out. It looks like there's a question about, can I use the IP of the server to set up the endpoints? I do not trust the DNS in my company. I think typically, so my understanding is typically on a standard availability group, and I will tell you I'm not a availability group pro, that IP address is preferred. However, for setting up distributed availability groups, at least per the Microsoft documentation, using a URL is the preferred method. I think it can support IP address, but I'm not 100%. Sorry about not being able to increase the size of the query window. And what's the benefit of distributed availability groups? I think one of the benefits of distributed availability groups is it kind of gives you a clean path of migrating from one section to another. So, you can set up, you can make it all one big availability group and make them asynchronous. However, I think this kind of gives a clean cutover of, here's everything in one data center. I've now set the exact same copy up in another data center, and I can just kind of flip the switch on moving from one section of availability groups to the other. I do not know the recommended network bandwidth and a connection string. So you cannot connect to a distributed availability group. That's one of the reasons that there's not a listener. And so that's where you're going to want to work with your networking team and probably your development team in terms of doing that migration. I talked to some of the Microsoft employees, and some of the recommendations I've gotten are you kind of want to greenfield it. So if you're moving from one data center to another, you actually ideally, that new data center would have all the applications set up with that new listener URL. And so it really would just kind of be taking the, flipping the switch from one data center to another in terms of that application functionality. And I think that's it for the questions, unless there are any that pop up. So I appreciate you guys joining. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or email, and I think I'll get this slide deck over. This will be on YouTube, so you guys can review this at any point in time. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, for presenting today. Thank you everyone for attending. Keep an eye on your email inboxes. We will get information out about next month's meeting, and we will see you then. Have a good one.